Hello, everybody. Welcome to our next Sweetspot Safari. Today, in addition to our usual John and Ben, we have Dr. Johnny Symonds, who actually is the Managing Director of the Products Division of Combustion. And we're going to be talking today about the possible polarities and differences between craft work, skill-based craft work, and process or machine automation. And I'm very interested in this topic. I'm sure Ben and John, or Johnny are too. I'm going to see where it goes and where it's going to take us and see if there are some synergies and some sweet spots as well as potential polarities and how it's going to affect life and society. So without further ado, what I'd like to do is introduce Dr. Johnny Symonds, who can then go and introduce himself, and then we'll get into the exploration. So over to you, Dr. Johnny.
Thanks very much, John. So yes, I'm Johnny Symonds. I'm a child of the mid-70s, born in rural Norfolk, the son of a smallholder and a former nurse. I've always sort of been interested in technology. I don't really know where it came from. My dad had been a car mechanic in a previous life, and I grew up amongst rather old tractors and vehicles that we were always repairing. I still have a couple of those tractors now, including a 1948 little grey Fergie that I keep running. I think possibly being an only child growing up in the country, right at the time when home computers became established, I had a computer from the age of about 8 and learnt to program on it. And I think one of the sort of hands-on engineering things I still do in my job at the moment is programming. I'm an enthusiastic amateur when it comes to such things. So I attended a state school in Swaffham, was always interested in science and engineering, and then got a place at Sydney Sussex College, Cambridge, when I went on to study natural sciences and specialised in physics. I then went on to do a PhD in either chemical physics or physical chemistry, depending on who I'm speaking to, although truth be told, I don't know very much chemistry. I built an ultra-fast laser system for examining a fairly simple chemical reaction on a metal catalyst surface. I then, after doing a postdoctoral appointment at the university, essentially to write some papers up, I joined the company I'm at now, Combustion. I've been there for 19 years, coming up to 20 next year. I started off as a research scientist. I'm now, as you mentioned, the head of one of the 2 business divisions at Combustion. So Combustion is a company in Cambridge. We employ about 70 people. We started off, as the name might suggest, manufacturing things for the automotive industry, for the internal combustion engine, such as emissions analyzers. I now head up the part of the company that develops instrumentation, which is no longer just limited to automotive emissions. It includes medical applications, environmental studies, that kind of thing. The other part of the business is powertrain testing, formerly internal combustion engines, but nowadays also electric and hydrogen powertrains. So I head up that bit of the company. I'm also responsible for research and development, for developing new products. And we're very much in the craft end of manufacturing. So we sell double digits of a given product in any year. Many things are custom. We're certainly not a sort of automated production house. Most of what we build is built by subcontractors in the UK, and we quality control and test everything in Cambridge. So I'm very much coming from the craft side of this debate in terms of my experience. Outside of work, I mentioned I've got a few old vehicles, including a couple of tractors and an MG, and a few other cars as well. I'm the tail end of my round tabling career, which is where I initially met you, John. Heading up to 41 Club, so based in Bury St Edmunds. We do things to support the local community. In fact, you heard it here first. We've got a coronation celebration coming up in about 3 weeks that we're organising. I think this might be the official announcement. And we organise the fireworks every year, so I've been involved with that, and we'll carry on in my sort of emeritus position in 41 Club, as indeed you do, John. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's it. I've always been enthusiastic about computers in or without of work, so I've always had a little bit of programming on the side, a little bit of electronics. I'm starting to enjoy gardening as I get older. I thought it would never happen, but finally, I sort of grew up in an agricultural environment where gardening involved just cutting meadows or something like that. But I've recently got obsessed by dahlias, so I think that's middle
Okay,
age truly upon me.
brilliant.
So that's me in a nutshell, John.
Well, thank you very much, Johnny. Yeah, very interesting. I can see some potential polarities and sweet spots there already before we go into it. I think just as a recap for everybody, when we've done a number of these topics, a lot of what we discuss is heavily contextual and heavily quite nuanced, and we look at it from different perspectives. But just to give everybody a bit of background, because this may be a bit different topic from some of the things we covered before, which has been very much in either the creative, the arts, or the social science space, is that the history, people will know from their school history, a bit of the history of craft work. We've had the Bronze Age and the Iron Age, and then we moved into the Industrial Revolution. And then at the turn of the 20th century, then we went, we started to move away from craft, what was then called craft production, into more automated or more process-driven production. People like F.W. Taylor and Deming, if you want to go and research those people. But of course, the most famous one, the production line, was the famous Model T Ford, which was in 1900 and something or other. And then gradually, when we've looked at manufacturing production, there's been more and more different forms of automation being introduced. Now, of course, we've got robots, we've got some fully automated production lines, and obviously computers driving a lot of that. And of course, it's not just about manufacturing, of course. When we look at the societal side, we've got automation everywhere. We've got automated ordering systems, we've got social media with response. And of course, the big thing at the moment, of course, whether I don't know whether we'll touch on it, Johnny, later on, because I know you've got an interesting computer, is things like AI, and we've got Chat GPT, which seems to be the hot topic of the moment. So just really as an opening question, and then, as I say, Ben and I will just go through and ask questions as it flows, do you think that things like automation and craft work, and we know as craft was very much about the skill of the individual and experience and learning through experimentation, etc. Do you think they're mutually exclusive? Do you think there's some synergies there?
Well, they're certainly not mutually exclusive. I think they're, if anything, it's a continuum, isn't it? I'm not sure anything can be automated before it's been done by hand for a start. I mean, if I look back at things that I have automated, that they're usually things that I've learned how to do by hand in the first place, and then eventually, given instructions to something, whether that be a person to start with or a machine in the end to automate the task. So I certainly don't think they're mutually exclusive, and I think they will continue to be things which are best served by one and things which are best served by the other. Although it does constantly surprise me the things that can be automated. For example, I mean, we're eventually going to come on to Chat GPT, whether we like it or not, and AI. I mean, it will produce software for you. We've actually used it at work. It will generate a base bit of code for you, and yes, you have to tweak it to get it to do what you want. But I never thought 5 years ago I'd be wondering if programmers could be replaced by AI. I thought there would always be a programmer to do the programming for the AI, but I'm not so sure about that anymore. So yeah, but things change over time. But no, I'm not sure they're mutually exclusive, and I think it's a matter of degree. It must be, surely.
Well, yeah, that's what I would think. And as you say, it's interesting that the programmers being replaced by automated programming. My recollection were lawyers talking about, this is only 6-7 years ago, about automatic contract generation done by AI and things like that, with people like partners and stuff like that doing the final review. So it's interesting. It was partly a provocative question, as you know, really to go and kick us off. So just on that, Ben, because I know that you've worked in the finance industry, you've worked in also advertising and the impact of social media. Have any thoughts or reflections on that from your perspective, and particularly the society at large?
Yeah, I guess mine, I quite often have a historical perspective, and I guess rather than going into these now, my inclination is to think about the UK and how we're positioned, perhaps versus other countries, because we were the first into the Industrial Revolution, and that was a significant advantage. But if I think around in London compared to London undergrounds in other countries, we've kind of got the legacy of really Victorian design, with a lot of our infrastructure. And I'm just thinking about, just how the world has changed and how the UK is positioned versus other countries, and how well placed we are for engineering and industry, versus the likes of Germany, China, and perhaps other countries. Are we quite niche players? Do you kind of sit ahead? And just a little bit about the Industrial Revolution, where we've come from and perhaps where we are now and where we might be heading.
Good question. I mean, you're at the sharp end to a certain extent. Johnny, what's your views on that in terms of where we are positionally?
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the underground, of course, and automated trains. I mean, we can automate trains now. It's just that we can't do it because of industrial relations, to put it mildly. It's perfectly possible. DLR is automated, but we've got that going on the news at the moment with the rail unions. Essentially, I mean, we not only need drivers, apparently we need guards as well. So there may be more, should we say, societal factors at play than technological factors in the automation of the train system in the UK. I think we've. AI was kind of invented by Turing, people say. So we've certainly got the background to develop the systems there. Although of course these big systems are being developed in the States, like most technology at the moment. I think whether we choose to exploit it or not will not be down to the technology. It'll be down to the way that we run society, really, and the more general question of how important industry is to us, production in general, that kind of thing. If we're talking from that aspect, I mean, we are a nation of shopkeepers. We are a service providing nation. Perhaps in general, those service industries may be the last things to be replaced by automation, if indeed we're talking in those terms about replacing things with automation. So maybe the way our economy is structured doesn't necessarily lend itself so well as other countries to automation, because we are a nation of shopkeepers.
That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I saw a stat the other day. I always thought it was 80-20, but it's even more. I think it said 99.9% of the businesses in the UK are SMEs. So that validates your point about being a nation of shopkeepers. And that in itself might be a sort of societal barrier for, rapid development of AI, and automation. When you look at other countries like China and India, for instance, who've got huge populations and have been investing heavily in tech because of the size of the corporations there, that may be a factor. But that sort of leads me on to another one, which is sort of, I guess, building on a bit about what both of you said. What about cognitive bias in, say, software design, for instance? It's been at the moment in the social sciences, people are talking a lot about cognitive bias. That's whereby people's thinking is being skewed by either their background, their culture, their creed, or whatever. And obviously, we have different creeds, cultures around the world. And if, for instance, those people are large, countries like China, for instance, are heavily involved in software design, and they have a particular culture associated with that, in the same way people have been saying there aren't enough women in software design, is that going to have lasting implications, do you think, in terms of where things go industrially, economically, and society? I know that's quite a big question. That's probably one for all of us, really.
Is that like they used to say about computers, garbage in, garbage out? Is this like prejudice in, prejudice out?
That's a great way of describing it. And I know particularly the European Union has been quite worried about that. With the leads from Germany, particularly. So yeah, any thoughts or reflections on that based on your experience, Joe?
And not so much about my experience, but yes, I mean, I've heard say that you can end up with biased, prejudicial AI systems if the information they're being fed is biased and prejudicial. I mean, that kind of stands to reason, really. Unless I suppose there comes a stage where AI may be able to take a kind of a whole world view and go out there and see everything for itself and make up its own mind. But at the moment, it's being fed stuff by people, and people are biased, and people have their own opinions, and by omission, if nothing else. So I guess that's kind of inevitable. How you deal with that, I don't know. Whether you just whether you censure AI with a sort of set of politically correct rules or whatever that or you you've obviously got to try and improve the programming, I guess, or the information you give it. But yeah, I wouldn't even know how to go about doing that. But
I guess that would require some level of societal collaboration across borders, wouldn't it? Because you need that to set up the rules and the frameworks in order to go and do that. Yeah. Before I ask the next question, any thoughts and reflections on that, Ben?
Yeah, I'm just trying to get to I'm just trying to, I guess, just in my mind, I'm trying to be kind of clearer. I would like to get clearer about the distinction between human craft and machine, and I just wonder whether you, John or Johnny, have any thoughts on the values that underpin. So we value human craft. What are we saying when we value human craft? When we value and do machine automation, valuing in machine automation, which is different to human craft, and then before we kind of get to actually, well, how do we bring them together? What we're saying is, craft and automation is different, and humans and machines are different. And I just wonder whether our kind of challenges now are that differentiation, that distinction, and maybe we need to be a bit clearer about how we differ to machines. So my thought really is a values question and features question. What makes us different?
Johnny?
So do you want me to kind of maybe automations around efficiency, precision, kind of scale and kind of quantity, where maybe there's something different about humans which is more qualitative, more kind of inefficient or imprecise, but that kind of automatic creativity and differentiation. So there's a move with automation to sameness, and maybe there's something kind of, I don't know, different in humans, which is difficult to be automated. I don't know. Just thinking out loud. Anything there you want to build on?
I think it's
craft.
Sorry, you go ahead first, Johnny. Go on.
I was going to say that craft work involves highly specialized skills that takes years to master, and often involves high quality materials, can be difficult to work with. Benefit of craftswork includes the creation of unique and personalized products that cannot easily be replicated. Now, actually, I didn't write that. ChatGPT wrote that. But as opposed to automation involving the use of machines and technology to create products quickly and efficiently, which can also significantly increase productivity and reduce costs, making it attractive option for many businesses. No, I just thought I'd have a bit of fun with ChatGPT there. But well, I mean, craftwork's a human thing. Automation is a non-human thing. I mean, we probably value the people that program the robots, or at least I hope we do. But there's much more of a a person's centric value to the craftwork thing, because it involves the worth of someone's work, whereas the automation is presumably of much more benefit to the business and the finances. And now, of course, there's the argument that it, of course, relieves people of drudgery, and that certainly is true up to a point. Although, try telling that to someone whose work's been taken away by a robot, I suppose.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point you say about the drudgery. I know that was personal. A lot of the sales, if you look at the 80s and the 90s in, automotive manufacturing was, well, we can relieve you of the the less boring work and give you a more skilled job. Well, that's assuming, of course, the individual has the skills, for instance, in order to adopt that new piece of work, when they come off the production line. But I think what I was interested there, Johnny, was when you were talking about people-centric and values and stuff. And I was trying to think of an analogy whereby there is something possibly working in harmony there between people and machine. And actually, as you know, I'm a big fan of motorsport, and I'm thinking more and more about Formula One. If you look at Formula One racing car, the machine is absolutely, i.e. the car, is, designed and built for performance, efficiency, precision, speed, high acceleration, high DSI, everything, computers, but there is a man-machine interface, and that man-machine interface is the racing driver at the end of the day. The racing driver hasn't been replaced yet. They have to learn, their skills and their performance can be done through training, but there's still a natural talent, as is proved by Formula One. Even the best drivers who train inside out don't necessarily mean that they will be number one or number two. So there is an element there. And I just wonder whether there's a link between the people, the man-machine around pleasure. Because I was thinking the other day, what would the fun be watching robots driving race cars? Now, might be some fun for some people, but personally, it wouldn't necessarily be for me, because to me, then the robot driver would be just another extension of the machine. And I just wonder whether there's anything in that at all.
You think robot could? Sorry,
no, you go, Johnny.
I was just going to say, I just wondered, John, if you think a robot could replace a racing driver. A robot could pretty much replace a driver, or at least it's heading that way. At least if you buy a Mustang in the UK, allegedly on certain motorways as of this week. Do you think a robot could replace a racing driver?
I think it could to a point, but it will find a level, won't it? It will depend on how agile that robot will be and what the level is. Everything will be calibrated. If they're all different robots made by different people, but they all have the same framework and standard, there could be some excitement and pleasure in that. But at the moment, I think that's another area where a human being, for the moment, is still probably more fluid than a robot. It's getting there. I've seen some of the robots from Boston Dynamics, the ones that do the backflips and carry the trays of eggs and stuff like that. But I think what I'm just wondering, and I want to bring Ben in, is whether there's a pleasure element to this as well. Is that, is this all this automation, all this robotics, is it neutering our pleasure and our excitement or enjoyment? Because what automation does, which was designed for production and precision, is it takes the risk out of it, right? And I just wonder, as human beings, that, and I wonder, maybe that's the boundary point. Is that we still enjoy pleasure and we still want to take an element of risk. So how far will humans go? So, and I don't know that. So again, Ben, I know you wanted to come in. So
yeah, I think on the F1 point, I've been thinking about it for a few years, because I've been turned off by F1 increasingly, and I think that there's an imbalance, and I think there's an imbalance exactly where you've made that distinction that F1 is the best of both man and machine, and I think that what's happened is the machine force that perhaps it's easy to be nostalgic. You go back to the Senna times, the cars were a lot more basic, and actually there was more influence in the driver's skill and craft. For getting the car from start line to the checkered flag. And I think now, if you listen to a lot of radio calls, it's all about engineers. Dial this down, turn this, go to save tires, and actually there's this lack of warrior, like human putting themselves on the line, where actually it's driving by numbers now. And so I have this feeling that actually, that to your point, would I like to watch a robot drive F1? The way I'm feeling about F1 now is no. And maybe kind of Schumacher, times the early 2000s, okay, but it's slipped in the last decade or so. That the engines particularly have got more complicated with the hybrid engines, where they just were a lot more complicated to manage. And that's just kind of wonderful. I don't know if you think that I'm on.
No, I'm sure lots of people think that way. I think it's a great point. I think that's the point. Is the link here? Is the sweet spot pleasure? That's the question I'm asking, to this group and to the wider audience. What's the link here? Because there is a difference between, craft, as you say, more complex materials, skills learned over a number of years and practice and through experiment. Because of course, what automation does, of course, as well as in speeding things up and having more precision, is it removes a level of experimentation. The moment, I think the experimentation, I'm guessing, and this is where I want to bring you in, John, here, the experimentation is done by the designers, which are humans. So if you think about software, okay, ChatGPT might be able to generate some software, but the experimentation is done by the software programmers, isn't it? Even with robots and automation, if I've got that right.
Yeah, it can be done by the programmers, although it can also be, with machine learning. I mean, you set up the neural network and then it learns. So I mean, you obviously got to put boundaries on it. So I mean, the line between the programming bit and the learning bit is quite blurred, I think, and that's really the very interesting thing about AI, isn't it? Beyond its program, it learns. So I don't know whether that's the job of a programmer or whether it's the job of the people it's learning from. But I do agree that F1 is boring compared with most racing. By the way, I think it's kind of slightly sort of plasticized. It's fast, but it's not that interesting to watch these days, I find.
Yeah, and without sort of overextending the F1 thing, that triggers me into thinking about do we think the pendulum's going to swing back? Because obviously, we've got a number of people on this forum here who have been turned off by almost the over automation of something like F1. I'm sure it will appear in other sports as well. Do we feel that the pendulum's going to swing back because people don't necessarily want repetition? I was thinking the other day is that when I looking back at my lean experience of working in manufacturers, and generally, when we're looking at productivity and efficiency and we're working in factories, the adoption rate is usually pretty good in terms of doing it. You try doing that in a place where, like academia, for instance, where you try and get a lot of very, very bright, creative people, and you want to standardize them, for want of a better word. I know it sounds like a horrible expression. I am sure there'll be a level of kickback, and you've worked in universities as well, Johnny, and stuff like that. So I just wonder whether, again, this thing is very nuanced, it's situational, it's contextual as well, because the assumption is that what has been the robots taking over the world. I'm not so sure, right?
Well, I'll give you a prime example of something that's kicked back or gone the other way. So 20 years ago, go to any petrol station in the UK and you'd see an automatic car wash. Well, they're taking them out because people have started washing cars again. And there are lots of reasons for that. The primary reason is that people are better at washing cars than machines. I know about you, John, but I never put my car through an automated car wash these days.
No, absolutely not.
For better or for worse, there's the supply of labour that's economically viable to do it. And I know that there's a study last year, I think from Nottingham Trent University, that said that over 90% of hand car washers have illegally employed people in one way, shape, or form. And that's perhaps an entirely different discussion of how it can be done so cheaply, but nevertheless, that's something that, when automated and has gone back again, that's everywhere, really. So yeah, I'm sure that the pendulum will swing back on lots of things, because actually human hands it's very important to remember that this is not just about brains, this is also about hands. And people talk about artificial intelligence, and that's great, but the human hand is a very dexterous thing. We've all seen JCBs trying to pick up eggs as a demonstration, and it's wonderful, but actually even in terms of washing a car, the human hand is a very dexterous thing. And when it comes to the caring professions, for example, it's very hard to see how, even if the robots have the intelligence or even some sort of limited empathy with people, it's hard to know they would. It's hard to imagine how they would have dexterous enough hands to do some of the tasks that these jobs take. Almost, although these things come on all the time, but I think that's a bit difficult nut or even egg to crack with technology.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that there are limitations, but they are going to do more things than we expect at the same time as well. And so there's both things are true. But I think John, you planted a kind of seed in my head about what it is. You mentioned pleasure, and I think you just made. I think I can't remember which one, John or Johnny, who it was, but I think uncertainty as well, and actually this element of uncertainty in kind of sport maybe kind of reveals what we may be scared of, that machines are incredibly predictable, and that's kind of revealing perhaps we quite like uncertainty and surprise and possibility, and actually that's part of life. And I kind of another sport analogy is the technology in football has the ball gone over the line, and I think taking out that element of surprise and to kind of be very predictable, and okay, it's definitely a goal or it's definitely not a goal, but sport is meant to be entertaining. It's meant to be unpredictable. It's meant to have things which are unexpected, and human referees make mistakes in the same way that drivers make mistakes. And actually, if you make everything too safe and predictable, actually that's not entertainment. And so maybe that kind of connects really with your kind of pleasure angle, John. I don't know if there's something there, but anyway, I just wanted to loop back.
There's an old science fiction trope that occurs several times in various in genres, where you have two robot racers that are fighting each other, and neither can win because they all make the same decisions, and they're lost in a stalemate. It usually involves kidnapping a human being to control the battle computer or something, to inject mistakes and human factors into the decision making. So yes, you're right. You do need some sort of dithering or fuzziness to it that to create chances, to create unpredictability.
Yeah, absolutely. Any thoughts on that connection, John?
Yeah, I do. I think there's it's an interesting thread. I think also there's an element of isolation as well that we have to consider, both in terms of active and passive. So I saw a documentary recently, and funnily enough, they were talking about relationships, but it inevitably got on to sex bots, which the adoption rate it seems to be on the increase, but it seems to be in one or two countries. But arguably the sex bot is for emotional connection and pleasure and everything else as well. But I do wonder, because I remember discussing afterwards, is how far that will really go, and what's the trigger for that? Are people using that as an alternative because they feel isolated? So actually, because they feel isolated, they're turning to technology. I'm obviously not going to go into the machinations of the process, but or is the technology creating isolationism? People. We've just come through the COVID pandemic, and of course, there's all the issue about hybrid working and working from home and stuff, and then hopefully we're all going to come back to work. And then we're all going to reconnect with each other. There's going to be an emotional connection. So I think there's a connection around isolationism as well, or not being isolated, depending on which side of it. Whether you want to be isolated, whether you don't want to be isolated. And I think that going back to Johnny's point about craft and skill. We've seen a load of TV programs recently. If you look at it on the great sewing bee, for instance, where people make clothes, for instance, out of old garments, the pottery throwdown. That's all about individual manual dexterity, to your point of view, rather than automation, and those viewing figures are up. So again, I'm just wondering whether the pendulum is swinging.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a wonderful novel that I read when it came out 3 years ago by Kazuo Izaguro called Clara and the Sun. And it's about a society in which children have artificial friends who are robots, basically, that are designed to school them, to be the companions, and it explores all sorts of themes in that direction. And part of it's from the point of view of the robot called Clara, and how she perceives the world of these children. It's a great book and it's recommended, but there's some very intelligent points made in that book. So I thoroughly recommend that, and a sort of slightly more literary approach to artificial intelligence than some of the computer stuff we see.
Well, maybe that's, I'm just thinking that's a useful trigger as well. Maybe that's yet another potential connection, is that writing about, for instance, the emotional aspects, right, and the connectivity aspects of automation and things like that, whether that's where there's yet another boundary and a connection. And I'm beginning to wonder in this, as we bring this one to a close, in this particular topic, and I'd be interested to get both your reflections, is whether there is a sweet spot or really is there a connection or a boundary, right? Maybe in this context, maybe a sweet spot isn't maybe the right analogy or determination, whatever you want to call it. Maybe there is just a boundary and a connection, where craft meets automation, again, without it being just exclusive on its own. What do you think? I'll throw that to the floor.
Yeah, I think just one thought that comes to mind is that we've been entangled. Humans have been entangled with technology, for most of our evolution is human beings. Technology has become an extension of us, really, from even fire is in some ways an extension of our guts, allowing food to be cooked and allowing us to take on extra nutrients. It changed how we consume food. The car seems like we both like, is an extension of our legs and bodies. So we have this almost intuitive sense of the car is an extended part of our bodies, and the internet, if you like, is an extended part of our minds. And so I think we've always there isn't this kind of real definitive where humans stop and technology takes over. It's kind of really entangled. And I guess just AI is another element, but do we want to plug everything into GPT-4 or be in a few weeks or few months time? And so I don't know if there's any way of us not becoming augmented with technology. So they're kind of my thoughts. It's mainly kind of maybe how quickly and in what contexts do we want to kind of create nature time, kind of more. I think is actually spending more time people with screenshot in nature, but then being a bit more intentional with technology and having the best of both worlds. I don't know an easy solution.
Johnny, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's there was a program on the radio that I was into about Google Glass and how that failed. Of course, that was another interface to the world, augmented reality, and sometimes you can get augmented reality that will sort of simulate what your house would look like when it's decorated, when the furniture's gone into and everything, and there's all sorts of things you can do now at home in that way. But Ben's absolutely right. We've always had that interface between man and machine it's been a blurry one for a long time. It's like you're not really, after you've driven somewhere, you're not really conscious between the connection between you and the machine. You just sort of do it. It's like having an extra leg, or I can't say the same is true of my typing, I'm afraid, sadly, even now. But at least my mouse operation is fairly autonomous. But maybe I should have got a typing skill. But that interface has been certainly, if people have loosely our generation have not really known anything any different. It was interesting when I was, because my mum never learnt to type or anything, and when I got her eventually in her old age to use an iPad, it was things like the things that we all take for granted, like just using the shift key to give you capital letters. Absolutely no idea about that. We just assume that that's built into the human brain, but it isn't. It's something we've all had to learn. We've forgotten when we learnt it, but and we just take it for granted. So
yeah, that's really interesting as you say that. I mean, it's just got me thinking again, is that whether, we've talked a bit about the boundaries in terms of not the interface between the two, but how far will it go, particularly automation? And I'm wondering now whether that's driven still by humans and they're in control, because it's around fear and value. People have different levels of risk tolerance. People have different levels of risk aversion. And I'm using that in the context of, will the robots take over? How far are we going to go? And it could vary. I mean, one man's pleasure is another person's pain, and vice versa. So I just wonder whether there will be differences, and it will be down to a human element like fear or value, for instance, rather than actually the machines just controlling everything. I'm not best placed to answer that one.
If the robots do take over, then I suspect it'll go much farther than we think it will do. I think the robots will have something to say about that. But yeah, we might have a choice at that point. But
true.
So I just wonder, can I just make an observation? And John, you're from Norfolk, plenty of countryside, plenty of farm shops, and I think about food, and I think about the challenges with industrial agriculture, and I'm not going to go there, but I think about going into supermarkets, and I see these kind of rows and rows and rows of food, and then kind of miserable looking cashiers. And I'm more inclined to use an automatic, machine when I go into a supermarket. But I wouldn't want to go into a farm shop and deal with a machine. Actually, I want to deal with a human in a farm shop. There's something about maybe kind of different context and environments. Same with like an Amazon warehouse. Actually, maybe that's where robots should be working. And the same with supermarkets, and actually, maybe in other. Actually, it's really, really good to see people, and actually, people will feel like humans working in a farm shop. So, I don't know. That in kind of my mind, I kind of reflect on that. Have we built society for machines, or have we built society for humans? And I reflect on that. Societies and towns are built around roads and the car, and will we make the same mistake with smart towns and smart cities, building it around algorithms and tech platforms, or will we build it around how humans actually function and flourish? That's the kind of thing which I think about.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, you say it was a mistake to build cities around cars. I don't know if I entirely agree with that, but but on the subject of cars and automation, I mean, autonomous vehicles are upon us, or at least on the boundaries, and I see that as a pretty good thing. Not necessarily from the point of view of my commute to work every day, but people who don't have access to transport at the moment. The elderly people who had to give up driving, people who are too disabled to drive, even kids, or people want to go and see their friends. I mean, I see that as being a sort of future of public transport in some ways, but sort of independent public transport. But that's just me. But so I don't know. I think it might be an autonomous car, but I think the car's got still a place in cities. It might be a clean electric autonomous car, but
yeah, but I think that's quite interesting you say that, John, because I'd like to come in on this. I think that this could be the speed of development or rate of change could be a function of the history. Plenty of people have talked about, the UK being the first industrial revolution, which at the time was an advantage, but could also be a disadvantage, because you've got legacy infrastructure, where people are actually overtaking you because you've got physical infrastructure. You look at our roads, for instance, when the Romans built the roads, it was straight. After that, they're all wiggly lines and all over the place, and we're very much of a sort of hodgepodge of organic development, unless you live in Swindon or Milton Keynes, for instance, So, that may be holding us back, because But there are places which aren't being held back. So if you take, for instance, if people are familiar, I'm not going to go into the details, the NEOM project, in Saudi Arabia, for instance, where you've got the floating factory potentially, you've got the ski resort Trajana, and they started building this building called the Line, right, which was there to hold between 8 and 9 million people, even more, which is, I can't remember the figures now, 270 kilometers long, 500 meters high and 200 meters wide, which is a whole series of community ecosystems with a massive high-speed train running beneath it. So that's almost the epitome of autonomous vehicles and ecosystems and communities and stuff, and that's being designed right now. But I think the big difference there is that it's being built on green ground. You know what I mean? It's a new development, and I wonder whether we're going to have this constant leapfrog of technology and systems and cultures and living spaces in the built environment, depending on what existed already.
Wonder if that train has a guard. Yes,
that's a very fair point. I would imagine it's probably going to be totally automated if the vision is correct. But you're right. But of course, when that's an interesting point as well. When you create a new community, which is from bare bones and from scratch, then to a certain extent you set the rules of that community, right? Whereas here, if you take the UK, and I'm sure it's the same in the US and other places, France and Germany and whatever, as things have grown up organically, the technological improvements have not been mandated or dictated. To a certain extent, they've been done through negotiation and development.
Do we have too many points of failure to have all of these automated systems? So the more and more we automate, and John and I have been talking about shared technology problems today, and I just wonder actually whether there's trust in whether if we hand over all of this utility and functionality to machines, do we trust that actually it will be entirely reliable if we're not only just not just relying on it for screen time, but transport and energy and basically key infrastructure? How resilient and reliable can it be? And do we? I don't know. That's just a thought, a nagging thought in the back of my mind at the moment.
I don't see it's going to be any less reliable than people. I mean, people are pretty unreliable sometimes. Somewhat cynically, but again, I mean, it's garbage in, garbage out. If it's programmed correctly, or if at least it learns from its mistakes, right? I mean, it's got to learn from its mistakes. It will make mistakes. Anything will, but it's got to learn from. Sometimes people don't do that, and an AI's got to learn from its mistakes. It's kind of in the definition of it, really.
Yes. Yeah, it is. It's almost in the script, isn't it? At that point, I think we're going to have to wrap up, and I think it's a really good point to wrap up. So, a really interesting discussion today, everybody. Sorry for the technological problems. It was interesting, as Ben said, alluded to. We've been talking about some of the internet technical problems we've been having today, which I don't know whether that's a physical thing or whether it's a human thing. We'll have to find out when we solve that problem. But I'd like to thank Dr. Johnny Symonds again for his input and his reflections and getting us to really think on this particular topic. Look forward, please, to our next one. If you like this one, please like, share, and comment, etc. I'm afraid we've had a few slight technical gremlins today, but I'm sure AI will sort that out in the future. So thank you very much, everybody, and look forward to seeing you soon.